I'm so super excited. But I want to tell you about Searchlight Series and what we're here to do tonight. Okay, so Eastern State Penitentiary was opened on October 25th, 1829, about 2.5 miles outside of the city of Philadelphia in an area called Cherry Hill. Eastern State Penitentiary was built for solitary confinement. And during their time in solitary confinement, inmates would reflect on their crimes and they would learn a skill. They would read it in the Christian Bible for moral instruction during their solitary confinement. However, Eastern State Penitentiary closed in 1971, and it was truly abandoned for about 2 decades. But today, visitors can take a tour by a tour guide like myself or an audio guided tour experience. We also host artist installations. This one in particular is Jesse Crimes' piece, and it's a mural that he made while he was incarcerated in the federal prison system. But it is now on display here at Cell Block 8 at Eastern State Penitentiary. In 2014, we added this massive bar graph that illustrates the rate of incarceration today, the racial disparity in our prison population, and compares us to the rest of the world. And we have the highest rates of incarceration in the United States. In 2016, we added an exhibit about mass incarceration that has won many awards. And it asked our visitors to consider their relationship to the criminal justice system. Even as we have asked our visitors to consider more difficult topics, our attendance is still thriving. We've seen a 400% increase in the last 10 years. But our next big project here at Eastern State is Hidden Lives Illuminated, an animated film by currently incarcerated men and women that's going to be projected onto the front facade of the penitentiary. And that exhibit will run from August 15th to September 12th, 2019. And we break ground on a new visitor center. We're really excited about that. And our visitor center will have modern restrooms and it'll have a wonderful glass skylight. And this is Searchlight Series. So it is the first Tuesday of every month. It's an hour from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. with a small reception to follow afterwards. So definitely try and come and see us next month if you can. And next month, we will be introducing Danielle Surratt. And she's going to be reading from her new book called Until We Reckon, Mass Incarceration, Restorative Justice, and the Road to Repair. But tonight we have Mr. Marc Mauer, so please welcome him. He is such a wonderful, wonderful author. He has so much information that he easily displays in his wonderful book. Please take advantage of reading the book. We also will be selling Marc's book tonight if you're interested in purchasing a copy. And if you like to stay in touch with Eastern State Penitentiary, please provide us on our visitor cards with your email address so we can give you information and correspond with that. But Marc's book is getting a lot of buzz. It is, like I said, called The Meaning of Life. And I was actually, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I clicked. Sorry, stand by. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. All right. So while I was reading Marc's piece and preparing for this Searchlight series, he actually mentions a woman by the name of Trina Garnett in his book. And Trina Garnett is a very wonderful woman who is currently incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, which is the women's super maximum security prison here in the state of Pennsylvania. I had the opportunity of meeting Trina Garnett during the 3 years that I was incarcerated at SCI Muncie myself. We lived together on M Unit, and Trina is such a wonderful person. We affectionately call her Buddy Buddy, and she calls everybody else Buddy Buddy too. It's a lot of names to remember when you're in prison. But unfortunately, Mark pretty much puts it in layman's terms about how the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has set a precedent for incarcerating juveniles at astronomical rates. So all of the juvenile lifers who are here in the state of Pennsylvania and nationally, all of those people, unfortunately, have come under scrutiny by everything that has started here at Eastern State Penitentiary. Trina Garnett was incarcerated at the age of 14 years old for arson out of Chester County, Pennsylvania, and she's now in her mid-60s. She's completely riddled with multiple sclerosis. She only can stand about 10 minutes a day. She's confined basically to a wheelchair. She also recently had an opportunity to come home from SCI Muncie, but has turned down that opportunity because Muncie is pretty much the only home that Trina knows. So please keep her in your thoughts. Please read Mark's book. There are so many people like Trina Garnett who need the opportunity to come back into the community and be successful. Trina is not the same person who she was when she was 14 years old and went to state prison. And there are many women and men just like her who need those opportunities to be the best people they can be outside here with us. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Mauer. Please help me give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you so much, Marnie. Thanks to Eastern State Penitentiary for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's such an important educational institution, historic institution, all that. Just to clear things up before we get started, there may be some of you here who came because you thought I could help you discover the meaning of life. It's printed in the book, and I can't help you with that. But I can tell you something about life imprisonment and what we talk about in this book and the arguments we make about how life imprisonment fits in with our mass incarceration in the United States. So let me start with a story. It goes back about 100 years. A man named Robert Stroud. In the early 1900s, Robert Stroud was considered one of the most dangerous men in America. He grew up in Seattle in a very abusive home. He ran away from home at the age of 13, moved to Alaska. Within a couple of years, he was working as a pimp there, and not long after that, he ended up killing a bartender who owed him a debt and hadn't paid him. So he was convicted and sentenced to prison, a 12-year prison term. While he was in prison, he got into frequent assaults and fights and disciplinary actions. And then one day, in front of 1,000 men in the prison cafeteria area, he attacked the guard and killed him. Allegedly, the guard had interfered with a visit that Stroud wanted to have with his brother who's coming to the prison. Now, my guess is that not too many of you know the name of Robert Stroud, but more of you may know about his nickname, which was the Birdman of Alcatraz. I've seen the famous 1960s era film starring Burt Lancaster. Stroud had been sentenced to death, but then got a commutation from the president to life imprisonment. And one day he's out in the prison yard, and there's an alien bird on the yard, so he picks up the bird and brings the bird back into his cell, and over the course of a couple of weeks, nurses the bird back to health and lets it go out. And then over many years, and with the aid of a sympathetic prison warden who was trying to help Stroud, he gave him an extra cell area. He cared for more than 300 birds from the prison yard, became a great student of bird behavior, bird diseases, and the like, and became one of the leading authorities in the country on bird behavior. He wrote 2 books, many journal articles. People would consult with him about bird behavior and things like that. Now, what's relevant here, I think, is if we look back to the first time he was sentenced in court for murder, or the second time he was sentenced in court for murder, there was no one in the courtroom, judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, anyone else, who would have possibly expected that this man would become a noted authority in the scientific world in the United States. All he was viewed as was one of the most dangerous people anybody ever met. So the lesson is very simple, and as Marnie has pointed out, people do change over time. We don't know on the day of sentencing what somebody's going to be like in 10, 20, 30 years or so. When we talk about life imprisonment, keeping someone locked up forever, we eliminate that possibility of recognizing that transformation that people go through. And the transformation people go through on the outside and on the inside. We're human beings, we grow up, things change. So what I want to try to lay out here, three main ideas here. First, to look at trends in life imprisonment. How did we get to where we're at today in the United States on life imprisonment? Secondly, what is the impact of life imprisonment on mass incarceration and public safety? And third, how do we go about abolishing life sentences? That's the subtitle for our book, which is The Case for Abolishing Life Sentences. And we think that's the direction that we should be going. So how did we get here? Well, life imprisonment in large part has grown along with mass incarceration in the last 4 decades. Before 1970, there were only 7 states that had a provision for life without parole. But around that time, as challenges were making their way to the US Supreme Court on the death penalty, some states became concerned that if the death penalty was banned, they wanted to have a backup penalty, essentially. Life without parole became that backup that they wanted. Many of you know, in 1972, the Supreme Court did declare the death penalty as it was practiced unconstitutional, although 4 years later, a different variety of the death penalty process was ruled as legitimate as constitutional. Then, starting around the 1980s and 1990s, with the real height of the Get Tough on Crime movement, wars on crime, wars on drugs, that's when life imprisonment took off along with other harsh sentencing policies. So mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes without parole, habitual offender laws, all of these just exacerbated the challenges, the prevalence of life imprisonment. Many of you know the 3 strikes laws. About half the states have some type of 3 strikes law. The California law from the mid-90s, as it was originally passed, was by far the broadest in the country. In California, your first 2 strikes had to be serious or violent crimes, but your 3rd strike could be any felony in the state of California. So there were 2 cases that made their way to the Supreme Court challenging the California policy, arguing that it was cruel and unusual punishment. The first case involved a man who stole 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store. He walked in the store, he had baggy pants, stuck the golf clubs down his pants, walked out, was immediately apprehended. The second case involved a man who stole $153 worth of videotapes from a Kmart store on 2 occasions within the same week. He was apprehended and received a life sentence as well. So the Supreme Court looked at these 2 cases, and the question was, were they cruel and unusual punishment? The court rejected that argument. They basically said, if this is what the legislature in California believes is necessary for crime control, we don't want to be in a position to second guess them about that. That's their job to determine what public safety should look like. So the golf club thief is doing 25 to life. The videotape thief is doing 50 to life in California. That's what some of these policies have brought us. I don't mean to say that everybody in prison is there for stealing golf clubs and videotapes, but when we have broad policies like this with no forethought about what the consequences might be, then it's not surprising that we should see extreme cases like this playing out. We also see this through habitual offender laws, which predate 3 strikes. Habitual offender laws mean if you have a first felony, you go to prison on, you receive a certain amount of time in prison, but if you have a second, third, or fourth conviction after that, you get enhanced penalties for those additional crimes, just like the 3 strikes law. This seems natural to many people because it happens all the time, and it's been happening for a long time. If you look at research in the field, Mike Tonry at the University of Minnesota Law School, one of our leading authorities on sentencing, he describes how the United States is unique in how it plays out with these kinds of laws, that in other democratic nations, if you have a subsequent conviction, the basic attitude is you already did your time for the first crime, why should we be punishing you again for that crime? Or if they give you additional time, it's a modest amount of additional time. They also look at what the relationship was between the two. If your first crime was 20 years ago, now you have another one, well, it's been a long time since you did that first crime. So as is true in many other areas of our policy, the United States is much more extreme, the amount and degree of punishment that gets played out. We've also seen growth in life imprisonment in terms of those people sentenced to life with the possibility of parole too, how things have tightened up and made even the possibility of parole become more difficult. I started working on these issues several decades ago in the state of Michigan, spent a lot of time with lifers in the state system there. At the time, if you were serving life with the possibility of parole, if you had a pretty decent record in prison, it was not unusual to get out on parole in 15 or 18 years, and that was assumed to be a reasonable thing to do. Today, the parole board in the state of Michigan has adopted a policy where they say life means life. Essentially, nobody's getting out unless something extraordinary happens. Now that's strange and I think counterproductive in many ways. When the judge sentenced you to life with a possibility of parole, the judge did not say life means life. The judge said life, but you can get out in 15 years or something like that if it's a reasonable thing to do. So the parole board is now completely subverting what the judge did. This is a judge who looked at all the circumstances of the crime, circumstances of the person convicted of the crime, turning that around completely. The other way to get out is with governors giving commutations of sentence and the like. This used to be a very common thing for governors to do. Frequently around Thanksgiving or before the Christmas holidays, judges in many states would give out dozens of commutations quite frequently. Now those are very rare. You can look here in Pennsylvania. The numbers have declined dramatically in recent decades in terms of how many people get a commutation. So where does that leave us today? Well, what we document in the book is that today 1 of every 7 people in prison is serving a life sentence. 1 of every 7. Either life with the possibility of parole, life without parole, or what we call virtual lifers, which we define as a sentence of 50 years or longer. So 1 in 7 works out to 206,000 people serving a life sentence. To put some perspective on this, there are now more people serving life sentences than the entire prison population back in 1970. That's the scope of what we've done. If you look internationally at how do our policies play out, if you compare the United States with the United Kingdom, we have about 5 times the population that the UK has. We have 1,000 times as many people serving life without parole as the UK does. That's the scale of what we're looking at. We also heard about juvenile life without parole, people sentenced to life without parole for crimes committed under the age of 18. Before there were recent Supreme Court decisions in the last decade, the United States had about 2,500 people serving such sentences, life without parole for crime committed as a juvenile. If you look around the rest of the world and you see how prevalent is this policy, sentencing juveniles life without parole, how many other cases are there around the world? There are exactly 2. There are 2 known cases in Australia where you have under 18s getting life without parole. So we've got 2,500, the rest of the world has 2. So there's only 2 explanations you could come up with for this. Either we have the 2,500 worst kids in the world, or we are a much more punitive society than all these other nations are. It's not a very good place to be. So why should we care about life imprisonment? Many people would say, well, people serving these sentences have committed serious crimes, violent crimes, and that's certainly true for the vast majority, although there are people serving life for drug crimes and even some property crimes. Most of them committed serious violent crimes. Well, I think there are 2 key themes, key arguments that we need to be looking at and why we need to critique life sentences. The first is its impact on mass incarceration. We're in a moment today when we're beginning to see a real change in the political environment around mass incarceration. For nearly 40 years, we had Democrats and Republicans alike talking about getting tough on crime, the need to put more people in prison, all of that. Today, that's starting to turn around. Just in December, we saw legislation passed in Congress, the First Step Act. It's a very modest bill, but it would provide more programming in federal prisons and some sentencing reforms in the federal courts as well. But if we really care about ending mass incarceration, it's not going to come about just by providing more drug treatment programs to divert some people into rather than prison. We have to look at people, even if they've committed serious crimes, even violent crimes. What is the public safety issue there? Life imprisonment also has an impact on sentencing severity across the board, not just for violent offenses. This comes about because if you think about sentencing structures, they're always proportional in severity by offense. So that is, murder is punished more harshly than robbery, which in turn is punished more harshly than car theft, and so on. Regardless of the kind of sentencing policy you have, it's always proportional. So the challenge is, in the US, the top of that scale is the death penalty and life without parole, which is far harsher than almost any other industrialized nation. So when you have that severe sentencing at the top, it exerts an upward pressure on severity across the board in the name of proportionality. So it means that even for less serious crimes, we spend more time sending people to prison. If you look at somebody who's sent to prison, the US, for a 3rd time car theft, he or she is going to spend more time in prison than for the same crime in England, Germany, Italy, or many other nations. So it has a ripple effect for all these other crimes as well. So the problem about how life imprisonment affects mass incarceration, but life imprisonment, I would argue, is also counterproductive for public safety. Now, this may sound counterintuitive because we're talking about people committing serious crimes and putting them in prison where they're incapacitated from committing more crimes in the community. How could it be counterproductive for public safety? Well, it basically gets back to something we've known in criminology for a very long time, which is that people age out of crime, essentially. So we know that when young boys and young girls, to some extent, turn 14, 15, 16, their risk of getting involved in crime starts to go up pretty rapidly. Why? Because they're teenagers, right? Teenagers do stupid things, crazy things, and all that. They don't have much sense of the future. They're impulsive, they lack maturity, all those kinds of things. So much greater risk of involvement in the late teen years and early 20s, but by the mid-20s, their risk of involvement in crime starts to decline, and declines more so in the 30s and 40s. Certainly by the time people are in their 50s, 60s, or even 70s, their risk of involvement, their risk to public safety is really very minimal. So the problem with life sentences is that if we take a 25-year-old convicted of armed robbery and send him to prison for life, in most cases, by the time he's 30, 35, 40, he's already much less of a public safety risk than on the day he was sentenced. So for each additional year we keep that person in prison, we're preventing less and less crime, and it's also coming at a greater increased cost each year, because as people age in prison, just as on the outside, healthcare costs go up. So it can cost twice or triple the amount of money to keep an elderly person in prison as to keep a younger person in prison. Now, some people would say, well, I don't really care about that. You know, even if we prevent a little bit of crime, that's something that we can do. And I think that's a real misreading of how we try to provide public safety. You know, we've got a finite budget for trying to promote public safety. And public safety can come about through a number of interventions. Any of us who are parents know that we try to get our kids good health care, we try to send them to good schools, we try to have good peer groups for them, we try to get them economic opportunities as they grow up, all kinds of things like that. And then yes, there's also the criminal justice system that's part of an approach to public safety. But what we've seen in the era of mass incarceration is that we put so much of our resources into the back end of the system, into incarceration, that we're diverting funds, we're diverting attention from the front end, which involves strengthening families and communities to give them the support they need to produce kids growing up in a healthy environment with good opportunities. Instead, we're putting all those funds in the back. So as we keep more and more aging people behind bars, more and more resources go there, we're missing out on those opportunities. Life imprisonment is also, I think, very problematic from a human rights perspective too. If you look at various court decisions in Europe just a few years ago, the European Court of Human Rights issued a decision in a case of life without parole, and they basically said that people in prison need to have a right to hope. A right to hope, meaning if they're locked up, there has to be some possibility they can gain their freedom over time if they do the right things. We also see in the United States similar policy recommendations. The American Bar Association, the American Law Institute basically say that sentences should be no longer than necessary to achieve societal objectives. Well, I think if we look at life imprisonment, we can't say that it's being at the exact rate to meet societal objectives. It's going far beyond what that should look like. Okay, so then we say, how do we abolish life sentences? That should be our goal. So how do we go about doing that? Well, in one area, going through the courts and litigation, there's been some surprising success in recent years. If you look at, again, Juvenile Life without parole, there have been 3 decisions by the Supreme Court the last decade, the relatively conservative Supreme Court, 3 decisions to scale back the implementation of life without parole. The first decision, the case called Graham, said that you couldn't impose life without parole in a non-homicide case. The second decision said that you couldn't impose it in a mandatory way, that a judge had to have the discretion to decide if life without parole was appropriate or some lesser sentence was. And the third court case said that the previous one of the mandatory sentencing had to be made retroactive and applied to people currently in prison. So across the country, hundreds of people are in the process of being resentenced in various states who had previously been automatically sentenced to mandatory life without parole, which is, many of you probably know, is the case here in Pennsylvania, which leads the country in the number of juveniles serving life without parole. It has for many years. So these decisions of the court were in large part based on the sort of belief, the understanding that children are different. And again, children are different based on levels of maturity, impulsivity, and the like. And the court essentially said that the level of punishment they should be subject to should not be the same as for adults because they are different. So we might think, well, this is very good, but then if adults are not different also, what is it about making the argument for adults around life imprisonment? Well, I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me that there are very strong arguments we can make about adults getting these penalties too. Most people don't just wake up one morning and commit a horrible crime out of the blue. If you look at people in prison serving life imprisonment, we see very high levels of trauma, abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental health problems, substance abuse, none of which excuses or condones the crimes they may have committed, but it should help us to understand the circumstances that contributed to their committing some of those crimes. So how do we go about making the argument that, not only children, but adults are different too? We don't all start off with equal chances in life to try to make it, and bad things happen as a result of that. So it's a proposal to get rid of, to abolish life sentences. In our book, my co-author Ashley Nelson and I proposed that we should have a 20-year maximum prison term established, except in unusual cases. 20 years maximum prison. Now this may sound provocative to many people, but if we were in Western Europe today, this would not be provocative at all, because in most nations in Western Europe, whether it's by statute or in practice, it's very unusual for people to serve more than 20 years in prison. So this is just the norm, this is the way it is. There's nothing that's scientific about the sentence of life imprisonment and what its impact here, how effective it may be, things like that. So the 20-year maximum prison term, we make the argument, again, that this is related to people aging out of crime, that there are very few people who, after 20 years, are still a major threat to public safety. We should recognize that fact. 20 years is a very long time to be isolated from the community. Those of you who've never been incarcerated, think back to where you were 20 years ago, what changes you've gone through in your life. It's a dramatic amount of time. People transform even in as difficult an environment as a prison can be. People grow up, they mature, they gain insight into their past, and they gain hope for their future. So we need to recognize that. We need to be looking at how to make that a possibility. So what about the unusual cases? Because there will be some cases where even after 20 years, somebody may still be a significant threat to public safety. One model to look at in Europe, the country of Norway. In Norway, by law, the maximum sentence is 21 years in prison, but there's a policy there whereby if it's determined that you are still a significant threat to public safety, you can be held for periods of up to 5 years additional time, and the 5 years is supposed to be devoted to preparing the person for release. So what kinds of support, what kinds of therapy do we need to do with that person to make him or her ready to be released back in the community? So the idea is, again, one of rehabilitation. These are unusual cases, these are resources we could try to apply to make this a reality. So the burden of proof is on the state to make the argument that the person is still a public safety risk, but then the whole goal is to get the person ready for release. So there are many practical issues that would need to be worked out. None of these are insurmountable when you put it up against the problems we have with life imprisonment. These are all very solvable problems. Let me close and then be happy to hear your questions and comments. Getting back, I mentioned I did a lot of work with life imprisoned people in Michigan early in my career. I spent a lot of time, I brought outside groups in to meet with lifers. I think that interaction is very important, both for people on the outside and on the inside. And one day I was visiting at the prison. One of the guys I'd known for some time came up to me and he asked me if I knew about the organization Save the Children. That's the group that works with children living in difficult circumstances around the world. So I said, yes, I was familiar with them. So he said, well, could you get me the address for the organization? I said, sure, I'd be happy to do it. Why do you want me to do that? Well, he said, I'm here for murder, been here for 25 years in prison. I work in the kitchen cafeteria, and every month, at the end of the month, after I spent some money in the commissary and other things, I had a little bit of money left over, so I'd like to send $5 a month to Save the Children. He said, I did a bad crime, I think about it every day, but I've never had a chance to say I'm sorry, never had a chance to try to make amends for what I did, and I realized $5 a month is not a lot of money, but it's one way in which I can try to make a contribution. So when we talk about mass incarceration, life imprisonment, I think we overlook creating opportunities like this for people to try to make a difference, people to try to make a transformation in their lives. And if we want to change, I think we need to consider, what is our commitment to punishment, or can we have a different cultural environment where we say we need to support families and children, both on the outside and people on the inside, even people who've harmed us in very serious ways sometimes. That's a big order, but I hope you can all come together, help us think about how we can do it. And again, thanks so much for having me here. So, yes, there's a question back here.
Well, all the things you said about people changing when they're in prison, obviously there's no disagreement, but from what we understand from these letters and what we read, the brutalization that happens to be in prison is working against that, and some people do, it appears, come out worse because of what we're doing in there. So don't you have to change that as well as changing the life sentence?
Yeah, just everybody here's the question. First of all, she agrees with everything I said, but makes a very good point that the brutalization that takes place in prison, the longer you're there, and all that makes some people come out worse, makes some people have even more challenges coming back to the community, and how do we deal with that, how do we incorporate that? I think that is true, and I think that's a real challenge. It seems to me that whether or not we can achieve a 20-year maximum prison term, we have an obligation or responsibility to try to improve prison convictions, because people are sent to prison to incapacitate them to move to community for a period of time. They're not sent to prison to be brutalized, to be oppressed, to be tortured, anything like that. So it's a real disgrace anytime we have conditions like that. Even if they're not brutalized, just the fact of being gone from the community for 20, 30, 40 years means it's an enormous challenge for them to re-enter the community. It's a challenge for somebody who goes away for a year, and it's magnified in a long time like that. So while there's a growing commitment to re-entry as a policy and programming, the amount of resources we put into it is still very modest. So if we really want to make a transformation, we have to get much more serious about what's involved in making a successful re-entry into the community. Yes?
Thank you very much for the talk. We all appreciate you coming.
Sure.
I had a question about the life means life policies. There's a lot of legitimate concern about bias and transparency in parole board decision-making processes. Life means life policies, from the way that you described them, from my understanding, negates the possibility of bias in that there's no room for parole. If we were to expand parole in these states that have life means life policy, how do we go? What are some of the ways we can start thinking about addressing bias in that system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, how do we deal with bias in parole board decision-making or other parts of the system? And we do know that racial bias and bias in other ways is part of the system, whether it's conscious or not, at each stage of the system, starting with law enforcement, goes to the courts and corrections, and parole is just one of the end stages. I think it starts from the top. We need to have commitments from governors who appoint parole board members or other political leaders to make it clear that any kind of bias like this is unacceptable. It means we also have to be collecting data on looking at all the people coming up for parole, how many granted, how many denied, what are the race, gender, ethnicity outcomes there. If there does seem to be a problem or one group is an outlier, how do we uncover what's going on there? How do we look at individual people's recommendations for parole? A whole host of issues like that. So in many ways, it's no different than what we're dealing with in law enforcement, racial profiling, and things like that now. These are not problems that are easily solved, but the only good news there is that they're finally getting a level of attention that lots of people are watching over the system, what it does, and there needs to be as much scrutiny of parole as there does any other part of the system too, I think. Yeah.
So you mentioned that sentences are proportional, and life sentence would increase the time of lesser sentences. With this proposal of 20 years, wouldn't that push down other sentences and sort of hurt any sort of deterrence for lesser crimes?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the question is, if we have a sentence of 20 years and push down other sentences, would it hurt deterrence? I don't think it would, and I think it would be valuable in a couple of ways. One is that people are spending more time in prison, even for less offenders, offenses than in other countries, and it's not as if this is come about through some scientific research about the optimal amount of time for a person who's going away for a burglary or car theft. What's the right amount of time to prevent crime or rehabilitate the person or anything. It's just sort of the way it's developed and culture and things like that. So I think there's no harm there. When it comes to deterrence, the one thing we know about that is that to the extent that the justice system has a deterrent effect, it's much more a function of the certainty of punishment rather than the severity of punishment. So when people are thinking of committing a crime, most people don't expect to get caught, but if you increase the odds of getting caught, some people might think twice. But since most people are not thinking of getting caught, they're certainly not thinking about the amount of punishment they're going to get. And if legislators raise the amount of punishment from 5 years to 8 years, they think they've done something. They haven't really at all, because that's not what enters into people's consciousness. So I think we don't see much impact there. Yeah.
Mark, I'm curious about your statement of unusual circumstances, conditions. You would give a max 20, 25, 30 years, but in some unusual circumstances that may be altered. Last week I got a letter from an inmate who is doing 2 life terms plus 55 to 110 running wild.
Mm-hmm.
And people hear and they think that's really overkill, and that's understandable. But when you understand the crime, when he kidnapped, raped, stabbed, burned 2 16-year-old girls, you may have a different perspective on that. Now, this person's been on ice since 1975. What's your thoughts about people who commit some particularly heinous crimes? Are they eligible, or if you hit some threshold, you've got to do 35?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, the question is particularly heinous crimes, and he's described some terrible situations. Do they get more time or something like that? In some ways, it's not that different a question than the whole debate around the death penalty. There are some people who would say, well, for particularly heinous crimes, no amount of time in prison is sufficient. That's why we need to execute people, right? The counter to that, of course, is that many of us believe, a reasonable society, a moral society, shouldn't be executing people. And there too, most of the democratic world has now accepted that argument. The United States is a real outlier in that regard. I think for particularly heinous crimes, I think in terms of what a society should be saying is that, yes, they should be punished more so than people who commit less serious crime. But that doesn't tell us what the upper limit should be. It just tells us that they should be punished more severely. So again, using the example of Norway, they made the decision that the most outrageous murder should have a penalty of 21 years, but lesser murders, if you think of it that way, or robberies or burglaries, are scaled down. So you want to give some sense of justice, proportionality. Yes, there will be punishment, and you want to make sure that the worst crimes get the most serious attention like that. And none of this tells us how victims of crime are going to respond to it. Victim responses are typically all over the map. Some victims want as much punishment as possible. Others want to deal with restorative justice and healing as victims. There's a whole range of ways people respond. But again, I think what is the system offering to us, and how is it set up in a fair and just way? But yes, it's a complicated question. I would agree. Yeah.
So how long do you sentences in this prison bill?
This prison?
Are they sentences? Sure.
The sentence? Do you know, Marnie, do you have something to say?
Most sentences, in the very early days of the state penitentiary, the minimum or the maximum was 2 years. At time kind of law. So a lot of crimes, for instance, murder, second-degree murder was one of the more serious crimes that people were incarcerated for.
Sure.
Okay, so the men and women who committed crimes that came to Eastern State Penitentiary, for the most part, they only did about 2 years, and those are on the lesser spectrum of serious crimes. When crime started to become more serious with first or second degree murder, then the inmates would be given a life sentence. But just like Mark mentioned, in let's say about the 50s, 60s, or a little bit before, inmates were only doing about 18 years and being paroled out into the community for a severe crime like second-degree murder or something like that. And then the changes had occurred in policy, and now people are doing longer sentences.
Yes.
I always remember a line from my favorite TV show, Law and Order: Criminal Intent. It's unfortunately not on anymore, but it was when a man does time, his family does it with him. And I always remember that line because certainly that's another reason not to have people locked up for so long, and especially with no chance of ever getting out. I just think of the negative effect on possibly a large group of people.
Yeah, the question, the comment is about, when somebody does time, it's not the individual himself, but his or her family as well. People often forget that, but, for a start, most people in prison today are parents of minor children, so those children deal with the loss of their parent, the loss of financial support, psychological support, the economic constraints it puts on families of prisoners and all. And again, that doesn't excuse the offenses people may have committed, but it's certainly something that we as a broader community, I think, should take into account when we think about isolating people from the community in a prison institution. Yeah.
There have been bills introduced in both the House and the Senate of Pennsylvania to change life without parole to life with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As far as I know, neither of those bills have even gotten a public hearing. So the question is, what do we may be concerned about this issue? What can we do to motivate something like the Pennsylvania legislature to deal with this issue?
So the question is, how do we deal with life without parole? How do we get legislators to pay attention? I think it sounds strange. There's growing momentum to look at these issues. We just looked at our office. There are 15 state legislatures that have had bills introduced just this year to scale back the use of life without parole. And you're right, in some of them, the bills are not going to go anywhere very quickly. But in other places, the state of Missouri had a hearing just last week. It's a bill introduced by a Republican legislator and scaled back life without parole to a 30-year parole eligibility. Part of it is, we just need to do old-fashioned political lobbying that your members in the legislature need to know that there's community people out here who care about this and to put pressure on them and support. Most legislators are not courageous people. They look at the ways that the political winds are blowing, and when the political winds seem to be favorable, they're happy to jump on and take credit. So we need to give them a level of comfort that they can do the right thing, that they can do what evidence tells us would be a better approach, and then get out and support that. So we have to do the day-to-day education. We have to get people contacting our legislators, write letters to the editor, all those kinds of things to get more priority for these kinds of issues. It's not going to happen tomorrow. These things take time, but we have a growing movement around challenging mass incarceration. I think this is the time to try to take advantage of that, even for challenging proposals like this. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you again for your talk. My question is, how does life without parole relate to the prison industrial complex? And do you believe that the uptick in people sentenced to life without parole is due to an actual business where people profit off of people being in prison?
Yeah, so the question is life without parole linked to the prison industrial complex and profit making in the system and all? For start, I think private prisons are a terrible idea. Let me just make that clear. We're talking about depriving someone of their liberty, and it seems pretty offensive to me to make a decision based on the bottom line of a corporation and how they think they can make money. Having said that, I think private prison lobbyists haven't been quite as influential as some people make them out to be. Today, there are about 125,000 people in some type of private prison, but that represents only 8% of the total prison population. So that's not trivial, it's not good, but it's not the main driver necessarily. And while private prison operators do make political campaign contributions, for a very long time, we had political leaders, typically in both parties, who were more than happy to adopt tough on crime policies, even without campaign contributions, because they thought it would help them win elections. The encouraging sign there is that, we now have 300 people running for the Democratic nomination for president or something like that. Several of them already, though, are making mass incarceration a key issue. Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, some others speaking up about this. And, you could go back 10 years and certainly 20 years, any Democrat or Republican running for president would have run as far away from these issues as they possibly could. So the fact that these candidates both believe in this issue and also think it's a winning issue for them, that's encouraging. That shows that, they're getting the message and starting to open things up a little bit. Yeah. One more, okay. You back here.
You use the word community, and it strikes me as, when I hear that word, it sounds like a supportive environment that gives back and supports someone and allows someone to be rehabilitated. And I wonder if a lot of people think that we can't actually be a community if someone has committed a certain crime, that they've severed their ties with the community. And it's not so much that they need to be punished, but more that we can't receive them. We don't know how to do that, and we don't owe them that sort of perception that they might have, say, even if they age out, we don't actually owe that to them. So they should stay in prison because we don't have a way to receive them.
Yeah.
How, first of all, do you think that fits, and why do you think people might think that? And then the second thing is, how do you think people who might think that could come to see a world in which we actually are a community? Like, what does that process actually look like?
Yeah, so the question is about the meaning of community. Is a community willing to accept a person who's committed serious harm against individuals, against communities? How do we make people more receptive? The short answer to that question is that you should all come next month for the Searchlight Series, because Danielle Surratt is a good friend and colleague who's just written a wonderful book about that, about the work she's done in Brooklyn on restorative justice, but not just in simple property cases, cases of violence between people in the community, and what it means to be a victim, what do victims really need, and how that's been manipulated in many ways by the political system. But no, it's difficult, and it's a process, and we need to work these things through. What we have right now is we have an adversarial court system that tries to determine guilt or innocence, or in most cases, 95% just involves the two sides negotiating a plea bargain, which may or may not resemble what crime the person actually committed. So there's no serious room to take victims' needs and perspectives into account. There's no serious room to look at the circumstances that contributed to the person committing the crime. So it's not a problem-solving or community-wide process in any real shape. So what we do need is to explore what other ways are there of communities coming together and dealing with problems, dealing that lead to violence or other crimes. And we also, I think, too often make this, I think, artificial distinction between victims and offenders as we talk about that. You know, we hear about what rights do people have, and some people think there's a finite amount of rights. So if we give more rights to defendants, then that takes away rights from victims. And, you know, that doesn't make a lot of sense. We need to look at the needs of everybody, and also, you know, those of us who have been victimized by crime can also remember times that we may have broken the law ourselves. So, you know, none of us is pure, none of us is solely on one side or the other. So how do we put that process in place? And Danielle will tell you how to do that next month.